Fans like myself have been hoping for something like this for years. We've wanted a smaller phone because of the one-hand reachability. That was the biggest factor. Ever since the iPhone X came out, Apple has not really had a phone that was friendly to being used with one hand. Sure, you had reachability. Sure, you were able to make some adjustments to your grip in the meanwhile, but shuffling a phone around when you're trying to do basic day-to-day tasks was menial and unnecessary. And the obvious weak point of having a phone this small is having a smaller battery. Since the screen itself has the same resolution, but it's in a smaller size, it is technically using the same power as the smaller phone. The internals are identical, they're just compressed, so the only thing that has a chance to give is the battery. One-handed reachability was always a big deal to me. I wanted a phone to just be a phone. I didn't want a tablet. I didn't want a big form factor. I definitely didn't care about media consumption on the go. So we'll start with the obvious and the not so obvious about it. The body size. Now granted, you are getting a smaller screen than the iPhone 12, but chances are if you value a smaller phone, you've probably come here from an iPhone 8 or maybe even a 7 or a 6, the smallest form factor you can get away with while still getting a slightly more modern phone. In that respect, you're not only going to find out that the screen is so much bigger because of the bezel-less design, but it's so much sharper and so much clearer because of the switch to OLED. It might not sound like much, but the first time you watch a video that you recorded, it's going to make a huge difference. Especially when you compare it to the regular iPhone 12, where the pixel density is not as much because of having the same resolution spread over a much larger screen. Or rather, just a larger screen. Now, as we know, Apple brought back the old design. The metal edges, the sharp, angular look, it looks really nice. But when it comes to usability, and especially when you're using it with one hand, and if you're like me and you give it a death grip when you do, you're going to notice that it does dig into your hand. It does have a different feel. And it's not something that you can't live with. It's not something that you can't deal with. And with the case, it definitely gets dialed down quite a bunch. But it is something to consider if you are the type of person to hold this phone for extended periods of time. In that respect, it can create some fatigue and maybe even some bruised spots on your hand. I found that after using the phone for extended periods of time, I get a slight pain in the middle of my palm from excessive use. It feels slightly like a bruise, and if you've ever played a guitar, it's closer to a callus. It's definitely not something you couldn't get past or you can get used to over time, but it is something to consider. And related to that, while the phone is definitely smaller overall, it is also thicker than the older phones. The predecessors, and especially when we're talking about the iPhone 8 and what you might have come to the iPhone 12 mini from, you're going to notice that it's a thicker, heavier phone. That does also make a difference in one-handed operation. Might not make that big of a difference when it's being divided between two hands and you're using it for extended periods of time, but in that case you're probably using a bigger phone anyway. Using it with one hand, it definitely feels noticeably heavier than the 8. Technical specs only mean so much, so this is something you're going to have to test for yourself and find out if you can live with it or not. For me, it's completely livable, it's a good exchange, and if I'm comparing it to other devices, I would rather have the smaller device than have the lighter device, the one that's easier to hold for longer periods of time, because I tend to do a lot more on the phone at the same time instead of just watching a movie, and in which case you're probably going to prop it on something and watch it anyway. And speaking of one-handed operation, you don't really reach the edges of the screen with normal use. From my testing, and I would consider my hand size absolutely average, I could reach it, but there was a little bit of a shuffle. It's a micro shuffle compared to a bigger phone. It would definitely not be considered a major motion, but it does make for a frustrating moment where you're almost there but not quite, and it's not detected enough for you to pull down the notification drawer or the control center. There's always going to be solutions for juicing it up more during your use, but there's not going to be a smaller iPhone. While this video is not necessarily about how the iPhone performs in the real world, I can definitely tell you that the iPhone 12 mini did not feel like a downgrade to me from an iPhone 12. At the end of the day, if you can handle a larger screen, if you can handle having to use your phone with two hands, the iPhone 12 is probably a better buy. It's a lot more balanced, and for the extra $100, I think it would be worth it just to get the extra battery life and have that peace of mind. But if you can handle lower battery life, and you want the extra pixel density, and maybe you don't care about media consumption on the go, or maybe your eyes are so great that you can see anything on that small screen, and I can't believe we're saying that about a 5.4-inch screen, but these are the times, then the iPhone 12 mini would be an excellent choice.